Thank you very much for the invitation to give the seminar. So in this talk, what I will do is briefly give an overview of the neutrino flavor conversion in dense astrophysical environments and the physics behind that. So this talk will be focused on dense astrophysical environments of the kinds seen in supernovae and neutron star mergers. And in those environments, what happens is not only neutrinos are produced in huge numbers, the neutrino flavor can evolve because of neutrino oscillations, as it is loosely called. So what I'm going to do is describe how the neutrino flavor evolution occurs in these astrophysical environments. And I will particularly talk about the matter effect and what happens in these dense astrophysical environments is that neutrinos undergo coherent forward scattering from other neutrinos, just like they undergo coherent forward scattering due to other matter particles in the sun. Okay, so I will describe that phenomenon. And then lastly, I will describe a few phenomenological consequences of that effect. Okay, so first let us start by looking at a supernova. So what is, why is supernova important from a neutrino oscillation point of view? And the reason is that huge number of neutrinos are emitted by a supernova. In fact, 99% of the energy that is emitted by a supernova is in the form of neutrinos. And it is very important for us to know how much of the neutrinos couple with the normal matter. And for us to know that, it is also very important for us to know what is the flavor of these neutrinos and how it changes with time. That can affect the dynamics of supernova. Okay, and that dynamics is not very well understood, and that is why it's very important for us to understand how the neutrino flavor evolution occurs. The same thing is true for a neutron star mergers. Huge number of neutrinos are emitted in a neutron star merger, and these neutron star mergers are sites of R-process nucleosynthesis. Now, R-process nucleosynthesis is the process by which some elements which are much heavier than iron, like gold and platinum, are formed. And the synthesis of these elements requires a very neutron-rich environment. And protons can be converted to neutrons and vice versa by neutrinos. So that is why we need to know the neutrino densities and their flavor in order to understand the R-process nucleosynthesis. So this is the motivation why we want to try and understand neutrino flavor evolution. So why do we want to understand neutrino flavor evolution for these astrophysical environments? That is because if you look at the interaction of neutrinos with matter, you will see in the top two diagrams, these are the charge current interactions of neutrinos with electrons. And you will see that only electron type neutrinos is participating. Whereas if you look at the neutral current interaction of neutrinos, then you will see all flavors participate equally. Now, in astrophysical environments, there are barely any muons present, and if there are present, there's an overwhelming majority of electrons over muons. So there is an excess of interaction as far as electron neutrinos is concerned. So if the neutrino flavor changes, what happens is the rate of interaction changes with matter. And that affects the coupling between neutrinos and matter. Okay. Now, just as neutrinos interact with matter, neutrinos can also interact with other neutrinos by exchanging Z boson, as described in these Feynman diagrams. Okay, so these will be very important for us later on. As we all know, that neutrino flavor is not a good quantum number. What does that mean? That means that if a neutrino is emitted as an electron flavor, then after traveling some distance, it can be observed as a muon neutrino or a tau neutrino. Now, for the purpose of this talk, what I'm going to do is completely ignore the tau neutrino. Okay, so we will work in a two-flavor approximation in which we only have electron neutrino and the muon neutrino. But all the physics arguments I make in this talk are applicable to three-flavor. Okay, so let us look at how the neutrino flavor evolution works. So if we start with a wave function for electron neutrino and muon neutrino, we can figure out how the wave function of the electron neutrino and muon neutrino evolves by writing down the Schrodinger equation. And the Hamiltonian contains off-diagonal terms like this, which is telling us that the flavor eigenstate is not the same as the mass eigenstate. Also notice that this Hamiltonian does not have a trace. The trace is 0. And that is because when we look at the neutrino flavor evolution equations, the the physical results are independent of a term proportional to identity. Okay, so if I add something proportional to identity to the Hamiltonian, nothing changes. So it is convenient to just work with Hamiltonian, which has a trace 0. What this is telling us is that in quantum mechanics, we cannot measure the phase. We can only measure phase differences. So if I just have one wave function, I cannot know its phase. I need two wave functions to compare its phase. Only then the phase becomes important. Okay. So another way of writing this differential equation is to say that when we have a wave function of an electron neutrino or a muon neutrino, after some time, the electron neutrino will get an admixture of muon type neutrino. Okay. And the overlap of the wave function with the initial wave function tells me the probability amplitude of either neutrino survival or neutrino flavor transition. Now, this Hamiltonian we have written here is only valid in the case of vacuum oscillations. When the neutrinos travel through matter, what happens is the Hamiltonian gets modified. So instead of this Hamiltonian we had earlier, what we have is a term which is proportional to the number of electrons minus the number of positrons. But in most astrophysical environments, there are barely any positrons, so this is usually set to 0. Where does this term come from? The way this term arises is due to coherent forward scattering. So let me explain what coherent forward scattering means. So let us suppose we have a plane wave of electron neutrinos approaching this thermal bath of electrons. And as the plane wave of electron neutrino approaches this bunch of electrons, what happens is that the neutrino scatters of all the electrons and the scattered wave front, which you can see in magenta, is emanated from each and every possible scatterer. Now, if we just add the scattered waves, from all the possible scatterers, then you can see that the result is again a plane wave. In that sense, when we look at the momentum change, that is, what was the momentum of the initial wavefront and the final wavefront, that is the same. Okay. Now, it is very important that this is a thermal bath. What do we mean by that? I cannot precisely know what is the momentum of these electrons? If we know what the precise momentum of these electrons is, then we will be able to figure out which electron underwent a scattering. Okay, and then there will be no constructive interference in the forward direction, and we will not get a coherent forward scattering. This is just like the double slit experiment. If we try to figure out in a double slit experiment which slit the photon went through, the interference pattern will disappear. Even if in principle we can figure out which slit the photon went through, the interference pattern will disappear. The same thing happens here, that when the neutrino scatters of electrons, we should not be able to figure out which electron was responsible for scattering. Otherwise, the constructive interference in the forward direction will disappear. So what has happened here? We have a electron neutrino wave front came, moved in the forward direction with the same momentum, so nothing happened. But that is not true. If there was no coherent forward scattering, the wavefront would have been this. But instead, we got a phase shift due to this coherent forward scattering. And that phase shift is what interferes with the vacuum amplitude and leads to the matter effect. So this scattering is different from the normal scattering we talk about from a potential well, in the sense that in coherent forward scattering, there's a constructive interference in the forward direction, because of which the wavefront does not change momentum, but there is a change in the phase. Now, similar thing happens when a neutrino approaches a medium made up of other neutrinos. And the phenomenology associated with it is far more interesting. But unlike the Hamiltonian for matter effect, you will see that the Hamiltonian contains density matrix for neutrinos. This is the density matrix for neutrinos in the medium. And the density matrix can, in principle, have off-diagonal terms. So before we look at what the implications of this are in an astrophysical system, let us first recap what a density matrix is. Let us suppose we have a gas of neutrinos represented by these Gaussian wave packets. Okay, so the red wave packets are electron neutrinos and the blue wave packets are muon neutrinos. If we have a gas of these electron neutrinos and muon neutrinos, the number of electron neutrinos is this rho EE term, and the number of muon neutrinos is proportional to the rho mu mu term. But what about the off-diagonal term? In order to have off-diagonal term, we need a superposition of electron and muon neutrinos. Only then can we have this off-diagonal term. Okay. So what this is telling us is that if we look at the Hamiltonian for neutrino self-interaction, we are saying that the off-diagonal term in the Hamiltonian is a result of superposition of nu E and nu mu states. So now let us look at the diagonal term and the off-diagonal term of the neutrino self-interaction in detail. What is going on? As far as the diagonal term is concerned, it's not very different from the coherent forward scattering from electrons. But there is a subtle issue involved here. What distinguishes the incoming electron neutrino from the electron neutrino in the medium? And the answer is there is no difference. All I have is a gas of electron neutrinos and muon neutrinos, and there is nothing distinguishing the medium from the neutrino we are considering as far as the neutrino flavor evolution is concerned. So what we are saying here is that when we look at the neutrino flavor evolution of this neutrino which is coming in, we just arbitrarily assume that all other neutrinos in the medium, their statistical average is all that matters. And I forget about everything else. Now, this is called the mean field theory. Okay. So the diagonal term is easy to understand, but the off-diagonal term is really fascinating, because what happens in the off-diagonal term is that you can have a, if we look at this Feynman diagram, notice what is happening. The electron neutrino is exchanging the momentum with the muon neutrino, because of which the incoming electron neutrino, which scattered of muon neutrino, gets an admixture of nu mu in the scattered wavefront. Okay, as shown here. So what came in as electron neutrino becomes a superposition of electron and muon neutrinos. But then remember what we talked about, that if I know too much about the medium, then I should be able to figure out which particle was responsible for scattering, and the constructive interference in the forward direction cannot happen. The same thing happens if I know beforehand that all these neutrinos were made up of nu mu's. Because if all these neutrinos were nu mu's, then after the scattering, if the momentum exchange happens, then one of them will convert to nu e. And I will know which neutrino was responsible for scattering. So in order for this momentum exchange to happen, these nu mu's have to be hidden in a superposition of nu e and nu mu. That way, when the momentum exchange happens, it's very difficult for us to know whether the momentum exchange happened or not. And that is why when we look at the scattered wavefront, we do not know whether it is a result of momentum exchange or not. So the scattered wavefront now has to be added up due to all possible scatterings. And the result is a plane wave again, but instead of just being a nu e with a phase shift, what we have is an admixture of nu mu. So this is what causes the off-diagonal term. Now, and also the thing is, this makes the evolution of neutrino flavor non-linear in nature. Not only that, the neutrino self-interaction is velocity dependent. The reason why it is velocity dependent is because if we look at the self-interaction Hamiltonian, it's a current-current interaction. So we have one current here interacting with another current here. Now, if you look at the Lorentz index of this current, the only other possible physical quantity which has this kind of a Lorentz structure is the momentum. So this current has to be proportional to the momentum, and this also has to be proportional to momentum. Okay, so if we write down h nu nu, we know that h nu nu is the Hamiltonian, so it has to have the dimension of energy, and this GFNE has the dimensions of energy. So if we want to write down something that goes like P sigma, P prime sigma, which is dimensionless, the only option we have is 1 minus V dot V prime. Now, this is not a derivation. All I'm saying is that the fact that the self-interaction Hamiltonian has a velocity dependence makes sense. And because of this velocity dependence, along with non-linear nature of evolution, there are some interesting phenomenology that is associated with neutrino self-interactions. The first of which was discovered in 2006, where what was done was a bunch of neutrinos emanating from a sphere was considered. So on the x-axis, we have the energy from the neutrino energy spectrum, and the y-axis is the emission angle. And what was seen is that for neutrinos and antineutrinos, there is this weird kind of evolution, flavor evolution happens, which is coupled in such a way and in such a nonlinear way that we can get this discontinuity at this particular energy, depending on the mass hierarchy. Okay. However, this was done in what is called slow oscillations. That is, this kind of phenomenology is visible only when the neutrino number density is comparable to the vacuum frequency. Okay, so if we have too large of a neutrino number density, this kind of oscillations are not visible. However, if we have an angular distribution of neutrinos, which has a specific property known as electron-lepton number crossing, then these self-interactions can cause flavor evolution irrespective of how large the neutrino number density is. So what is the electron-lepton number crossing? It's shown in this figure. So if we have a angular distribution of antineutrinos and neutrinos, they should cross at some point. If we have such an angular distribution, then at some later time, what we can see is that the neutrino flavor evolves in a very interesting manner. And because this neutrino flavor evolution is governed by nonlinear dynamics, some strange phenomenology can be seen. One of those strange phenomena is the fact that collisions can enhance the amount of flavor conversion. Now, why is this surprising? Because what we expect is that if we look at direction changing collisions tend to destroy coherence in the neutrinos. So we don't expect them to enhance the flavor conversion rate, we expect them to suppress those. But because of the nonlinear phenomenology, this naive understanding breaks down, and we can have an enhancement of neutrino flavor conversion in the presence of collisions. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of how the collisions are incorporated in the flavor evolution equations, because Rasmus is going to talk about that in the next lecture. But Shashank, I hope, yep.
Oh, please go ahead and I'll ask the question. No, finish up.
So basically, what we've seen is that coherent forward scattering is very important as far as flavor evolution in astrophysical systems is concerned. The phenomenology associated with it is extremely rich. However, there are several subtle quantum mechanical aspects of neutrino flavor evolution in the presence of self-interactions that are poorly understood at this moment. Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, Shashank. This was a comprehensive review of neutrino-neutrino interactions at a high level. I liked it. We have one question in the audience from Jaime Hefken. He's asking, considering the different plots for normal ordering and inverted ordering, slide 19, can we set limits on neutrino ordering from the observations of supernova neutrinos?
Excellent question. That is what we thought when this paper was released in 2006. That is what the community thought at the moment. However, consequently, it was realized that these calculations were performed in a very simplistic model. For example, in this paper, it is assumed that the supernova is completely spherically symmetric. Okay, And because of the nonlinear evolution of these neutrino flavor evolution, the spherical symmetry is spontaneously broken. Okay. Also, in this paper, it was assumed that the neutrino flavor decoupling happens instantaneously and at the same location for all neutrino flavors. And that is not true. Because of which the conclusions drawn in this paper, it's not very clear now whether we will be able to determine the neutrino mass hierarchy just by looking at the energy distribution of the neutrinos from a supernova.
All right, thank you. I think Marcus has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Shashank. Very nice talk. So at the end, you mentioned also momentum transfer in the scattering.
Yep.
Is this, so you have a very dense environment of neutrinos. Do you also have to incorporate here Pauli blocking effects when you do this?
In this case, I have not done it. And I don't think it's very important to consider Pauli blocking, because here, I mean, we have to understand why this enhancement is occurring in the first place, right? So the reason why this enhancement occurs is because if we only have coherent forward scattering, then the neutrino number density is conserved at each and every angle. By having a small collision term, what we are doing is basically relaxing that conservation property. Okay, that is the important issue here. So because that conservation of number density at each and every angle is relaxed, we get this enhancement. Also, the Pauli blocking is important very deep inside the core. And these kind of flavor evolution densities are somewhat outside the core. It's near the decoupling region. So I don't think the Pauli blocking is very important in this case.
Okay, thank you.
And I had one question, maybe Shashank. We always hear that it is difficult to model the evolution, not model, but calculate computationally the evolution of neutrino flavor conversions in very dense systems. Maybe you can give us an idea of why computationally this is so difficult.
Yes. So let us look at this system. So how would we calculate the neutrino flavor evolution? So what we need to do is make sure that I independently calculate neutrino flavor evolution for each and every angle. Okay. So in this case, let us say I have 2000 angle bins, right? And the density matrix is composed of 4 real numbers for neutrinos and 4 real numbers for antineutrinos, right? So in order to solve this differential equation, I have basically tens of thousands of coupled differential equations I need to solve simultaneously. And this is one of the most simple systems I can consider, because in this system, I have assumed spatial homogeneity. So if we want to have tens of thousands of coupled differential equations at each and every point in the space, that quickly becomes very difficult to calculate. So for example, one of the papers I wrote with Ian, I think we solved like 100 million differential equations simultaneously. So it's just because of the sheer number of coupled differential equations we need to solve that the computation is very difficult.
Right, and that becomes worse, I guess, when you turn on new tau you wanted to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. I don't see any more questions, but of course you can ask questions on Slack and during the discussion time. So I hope, Shashank, you can join us at the discussion time in a bit.
Yes, I will.
After Rasmus's talk. Excellent. Thank you so much.